Hey guys, today we're going to talk about genetics and inheritance and what it means and how it looks when we get features or traits and genes from our parents. As a reminder, your parents would be, in this case, your biological mother and your biological father. So please take that with a grain of salt as we talk about this. The people that gave you your genetic makeup are who I'm considering when we talk about mom and we talk about dad. The other thing I want to make sure that you understand is that we have talked quite a bit about a lot of confusing things. So I know the concept of meiosis is not particularly easy. So please keep that in mind as we go about this. It's very important to ask questions and just to get some clarity as we go. A reminder, we are continuing our conversation on gamete formation from meiosis and how it looks when we inherit those particular gametes to create a zygote. And then that zygote again goes on to create a baby. The first thing we need to focus on is probability. Probability is the likelihood or chance that a certain event will occur. And so we can think of probability in our everyday life. You know, if we have a quarter, I can flip the quarter and say, oh, it's going to be heads. I have a 50% chance. I can flip the quarter 10 times and I still have a 50% chance of flipping heads every single time. So this idea of like, oh, it's got to flip tails soon because we flipped heads, it's not actually true. Probability is always the same every single time. Your chances are always the same. So we can take that idea and talk about that in terms of gamete formation when gametes are actually made and fertilization. Because while it's not always guaranteed a 50% chance of this particular egg dropping, there's a little bit of a higher chance. It's still the probability is still the same for every single gamete that's made to be formed, and every single zygote for every single sperm and egg to create a fertilized zygote. So the probability or the chances of this happening are always present. I want you to understand that there's always a 50% chance of her inheriting a certain trait from a parent. You have two parents. That means that one is always going to, or both are always going to contribute a particular trait. Now, it depends on what that trait is to determine what you actually look like. But for some people, like for being tall or being short, this is a contribution from both sets of parents. So even though I'm very short, I still contribute a height factor to my child, even if it's not the short trait. So meaning that in future generations, there is a chance that a trait could be passed on to a granddaughter, grandson, great-granddaughter, great-grandson, all of those different family members in a particular line. Each gamete formed will have an equal opportunity of inheritance. And so what I mean by that is that, again, every gamete has the opportunity to get genetic information. As a reminder, we create 4 haploid cells in meiosis. So you'll see here, this is kind of a small representation of that. And you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4. These 2 cells have this big letter B, and these 2 cells have these small letter Bs. But every single one of these cells had the ability to inherit a letter B. And we're going to talk about what those letters mean here in a bit. But I want you to notice we've made 4 cells. As a reminder, in meiosis for humans, we are doing this 23 different times, meaning that a lot of genetic variation is dependent on how those 23 chromosomes cross over, how they split apart. So it's much more than just simple 1 letters. So here, these 2 cells look identical when they're actually not. Same with these 2 cells. My point is that we're going to create 4 cells, each with genetic information from parents. So you can't ever get genetic information from anybody else. It comes from your parents every single time. And that's what's very hard for people to visualize, because of the fact that sometimes people have traits that are not traits their parents have. So they're like, where is it? Well, they can be hidden, but still present, obviously, because the future generations have exhibited it. All right, so how does probability come into play when it comes to genetics? So we talk about the genetics of inheritance, and basically what it means is the characteristics that are controlled by genes that are found on our chromosomes. And reminder, we get all our chromosomes or all of our genetic information that are found on chromosomes from our parents. We inherit the information. So genes for characteristics may have different versions called alleles. So an allele is a nice, I guess that's not nice, but it is a version of a gene. And again, everybody inherits 2 alleles from each parent. So you have your own, what's called a genotype, and we'll get to genotypes here in a little bit. But a gene has different types, and we see this all the time. You see people with a different skin tone, or with a different eye color, or with different hair color, different hair texture. All of these things come into play because of the inheritance that you have on your alleles. Again, each person has 2 copies of the same gene, one from mom, one from dad, and that comes from the splitting of homologous chromosomes. Alleles are represented by a letter. And again, I told you in the last slide, these are separated by meiosis. We're going to get into more detail about what alleles look like in regards to dominance and recessive. But for right now, anytime you see a capital letter, that represents a dominant allele. And whenever you see a lowercase letter, that represents a recessive allele, and that will be important. So let's get back to this. When I said earlier, I said genotype and phenotype. Zygotes inherit 2 alleles for each gene from each parent. I can't read this morning, sorry. And this goes on, these 2 alleles, the combination of them goes on to create what's known as a genotype. And that's what's found in your DNA. That is what is telling your body, hey, we are going to be really tall. And then your body shows that feature, and that's called a phenotype. So the expressed characteristic or the expressed trait, what you visually see is called the phenotype. The genotype is what's found in your DNA. And there are 3 different types of genotypes, or excuse me, there's 2 different types of genotypes. There's homozygous and there's heterozygous. Heterozygous means that the genotype is different. We have 1 capital letter and 1 lowercase letter. Homozygous is where we have 2 of the same letter. So it could be 2 capitals or 2 lowercase. Again, I'm going to go into that in more detail in the next lesson. So please don't feel like you have to know all this right away. This may sound familiar from 8th grade. I'm not too sure. I think you guys have talked about this before though. But when gametes unite, zygotes inherit 2 alleles from each parent, like I already said. And that is what determines your genetic makeup. Everything about your DNA is determined by the inheritance of that particular gamete's information, or that particular gamete, what it has inside of it. So again, we have 4 chances of making gametes for every round of meiosis, but only 1 of those gametes will go on to be fertilized. So the chances of a gamete being fertilized get smaller as we have more gametes present. The next thing I want to talk about is, how does this inheritance work, and how do we even know that this is a thing? There are a couple laws we're going to talk about. We're really going to spend our time only talking about the law of independent assortment and the law of segregation. So the law of segregation states 2 factors control a trait and are separated during meiosis. And we've already talked about that a lot, that every single homologous chromosome, and that's what these factors are, homologous chromosomes that contain genetic information, will be separated and just moved into a gamete. So segregation or separation, where it doesn't matter which one gets separated, but the fact of the matter is we have to separate the chromosomes. So it doesn't matter where they go, but they have to be separated. And so every single cell gets 1 version of that genetic information. And then as a reminder, sperm has 23 chromosomes for humans. So that's half of the information. And then, sorry, I forgot my train of thought. And then for the egg, same thing, half the genetic information. Those halves come together to create a zygote that has 46 chromosomes. So please keep that in mind, that when we're creating in meiosis, when we're creating those haploid cells, we are doing this by separating the homologous chromosomes that have replicated during interphase and then gone on to be further separated even more in the 2 rounds of meiosis. The law of independent assortment. So independent meaning by myself, assortment meaning assorted. And this law states that factors controlling different traits are inherited independently, meaning there is no guarantee a trait will be inherited with another trait. I know people say if you have red hair, you're guaranteed to have freckles. It is not the case. Humans are a lot different, or not different, excuse me. Humans have a lot more complexity when it comes to their inheritance pattern, but every single trait is inherited independently. The reason why you often see traits together, or what's called linked together, is because of the fact that they're so close on a chromosome that oftentimes crossing over doesn't occur. And so you could say this about skin color, and excuse me, not skin color, eye color and hair color. The reason why we oftentimes see certain traits inherited is because those two genes on that chromosome are so close together that the chances of crossing over, splitting them apart, are not as high as other certain traits. So keep that in mind. Again, you do not have to, every trait is not inherited together. It is independent. And this is all based on what traits are considered dominant and what traits are considered recessive. The last thing I want to talk about, and I feel like I've talked about so much and I'm probably talking too fast, that's what I do, is how we actually can predict the type of traits we see from two different parents. So what we can do is we can assign different letters. Reminder that these letters are a representation of alleles. So this particular parent here at the top, this little g, or yellow, this parent is what's considered homozygous recessive. The letters are the same and they are lowercase. This parent over here on the side, big G, little g, is considered heterozygous, and they are still showing the dominant trait. I know that this is the dominant trait. This green is dominant because this is a big G. So this parent shows the dominant trait. This parent is showing the recessive trait. And then when we do this mix, and I'm going to show you how to do a Punnett square in class, so please don't worry about me doing it right now. But when we show this mix or use this Punnett square, we're actually predicting the percent of different genotypes that can be shown in the future generations. So if these two parents go on to produce one offspring, they have a 50% chance, so these two top ones, of creating an organism or creating an offspring that shows the green color. That's considered heterozygous. They also have a 50% chance, so that's down here, of creating an offspring that shows the recessive trait, the yellow, by creating a homozygous recessive organism. So again, a Punnett square is a nice way to represent how the chances of an organism inheriting traits. And we're going to do a lot with Punnett squares. We're not just going to do monohybrid crosses like this one. We're going to also do dihybrid crosses. So that's always a lot of fun. If you have any questions, please make sure to ask me on Edpuzzle. I want to make sure that you feel comfortable with this information as we proceed on. Sorry, I'm trying to, there it is.